The wind came down off the Laramie Range like something with teeth, and Eleanor Whitfield was still half a mile from any shelter when the last gray light gave out over Bitter Creek. She was 24 years old, married 11 months and widowed 4, and she was walking into a blizzard because her husband's brother had told her, in a voice as flat as a nailed board, that the house was no longer hers to sleep in. She carried a canvas satchel with 3 things inside it: a wool-wrapped jar of sourdough starter that had crossed the Ohio River in her mother's apron pocket 30 years before, a leather ledger with her husband's handwriting crowding every margin, and a folding knife with a bone handle that had belonged to no one in particular. If you are watching this from somewhere warm tonight, tell me in the comments what state or country you are writing in, and if you want to see whether a woman left to die in the snow could still be standing come spring, hit like and follow, because this story is going to take its time getting there. Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, sat in a fold of land where the Bitter Creek slowed and widened before it ran on toward the Platte, and in the November of 1878, the town numbered 161 souls, a Methodist chapel with a bell that had cracked in transit from St. Louis and never rung true since, with a mercantile owned by a man named Otis Pruitt who weighed his thumb along with the flour, and a bank with a brick face that had been hauled in stone by stone at considerable expense to advertise permanence in a place that did not yet deserve the word. Eleanor had come to Larkspur Hollow the previous December, not as a bride carried by love, but as a woman carried by arithmetic. Her father, a mill owner in Zanesville, Ohio, had died owing more than the mill was worth, and Eleanor, the eldest of 4 daughters with no brothers to inherit the debt or the trade, had answered a newspaper notice placed by a rancher named Thomas Whitfield, 31 years old, seeking a wife of sound character and practical education, correspondence to be conducted through the offices of Reverend Amos Kellerman of Larkspur Hollow. Thomas Whitfield was not a romantic man. His first letter ran 4 sentences and itemized the number of cattle he ran, the size of his house, and his expectation that any wife of his would need to keep her own counsel through a Wyoming winter. Eleanor had written back 6 sentences, the last of which read, "I was raised to run a mill on a river that flooded twice a year and froze the other months. I do not frighten easily." Thomas had married her on the 14th of December in the Larkspur Hollow Chapel, with Reverend Kellerman presiding and the cracked bell ringing its off note over 4 inches of new snow, and though there was no love declared between them in the first weeks, there was a kind of respect that grew the way frost grows on a window, one clear patch at a time. He showed her the ledgers on the 2nd night. He asked her opinion on the spring planting on the 9th. By March he had stopped correcting her when she moved his tools back to where they belonged, because he had noticed she was usually right about where they belonged. Thomas Whitfield died in September of 1879, not of anything dramatic, but of a fever that came on after he rode 2 days in a cold rain chasing strayed cattle into a canyon that bore his father's name, Whitfield Draw, and never fully broke. He was buried on the rise above the house, under a cottonwood that had not yet lost its leaves, and Eleanor stood at the grave in a black dress borrowed from Reverend Kellerman's wife because she owned nothing suitable, and she did not cry where anyone could see her, though she cried for 3 nights afterward in the room that had become, in 9 months, unmistakably her own. The ranch was called Bitter Creek Ranch, 1,140 acres of grass and creek bottom, and 1 long rise of wheat ground that Thomas had been coaxing into production against the advice of every established rancher in the county, who held that Wyoming Territory was cattle country and always would be, and that a man who plowed grass for grain was a man who did not understand where he lived. Thomas had understood something they did not. In his ledger, in his own square hand, he had written a phrase Eleanor would return to many times in the months that followed. "The land tells you what it wants, if you are patient enough to let it finish the sentence." The trouble began 11 days after the funeral, when Silas Whitfield rode up from his own spread 8 miles east with his wife Cora beside him in the wagon, and a folded paper in his coat pocket that he did not yet produce. Silas was 36, 3 years older than his late brother, built heavier through the shoulders, and possessed of the particular certainty of a man who has spent his whole life believing that whatever he wants is, by some natural law, owed to him. He had run cattle on land half the size and half the water of Bitter Creek for a decade, and watched his younger brother, quieter and less liked in town, do better, with less complaining about it, and there was a resentment in him old enough to have grown its own bark. Cora Whitfield, for her part, had a talent for saying unkind things in the tone of someone offering sympathy, and she used it that afternoon standing in Eleanor's own kitchen, remarking that it was a wonder Thomas had lasted as long as he had, married to a woman who kept a ledger instead of a garden, as if a wife's arithmetic had somehow hastened her husband's death by chill. Eleanor let the words pass over her the way she had learned to let cold water pass over her hands when priming the pump in January, without flinching, because flinching only made the work take longer. "You'll want to think about your situation," Silas said, once Cora had run out of insinuation and gone quiet by the stove. "A widow alone on 1,100 acres. No sense in it. I'll take the cattle off your hands at a fair count, and the house besides, and you can go back east to your sister's with something in your pocket for the trouble." "The ranch is mine," Eleanor said. "Thomas's will named me." "Thomas's will," Silas said, and there was something in the way he said it, unhurried, almost pleasant, that should have warned her more than it did. "Names you as his wife. It doesn't name you as anything else. There's a difference in the eyes of the territory, and I expect you'll learn it before the snow's much deeper." He did not explain himself further that day. He rode out with Cora beside him, and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched the wagon shrink toward the horizon, and told herself that grief made people say cruel things they did not entirely mean, and that Silas Whitfield, whatever his faults, would not truly try to take a dead man's land from a living wife. She was wrong about this, though it would take her the better part of 2 months and one blizzard to learn exactly how wrong. Winter set in early that year, and Eleanor spent the first weeks of it doing what she had done every week since her wedding, though now alone. She rose before dawn to bank the stove, walked the fence lines with the 2 hired men who had stayed on after Thomas's death out of loyalty more than wages, and in the evenings sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under a kerosene lamp, running her finger down columns of figures the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old and too small to reach the mill's grinding stones without a stool. The 2 hands were named Walter Pruitt, a broad, slow-spoken man of 50 who had worked the ranch since before Thomas's father built the house, and a younger man, 19, called Del Ashby, who had come west from Missouri with nothing but a horse and a debt to somebody he never named. Neither of them had expected a widow to keep the operation running through winter, and both of them, within a month, had stopped expecting her to fail at it. It was Walter who first noticed that Eleanor did not merely keep the books. She read the land the way Thomas had read it, walking the wheat ground on the rise above the creek in the gray hour after chores, kneeling sometimes to press her palm flat against the frozen furrows, as if she could feel through her glove whether the seed Thomas had planted in October had taken hold before the ground locked hard. "You don't need to be out here every morning, ma'am," Walter told her once, watching her rise from the frozen dirt and brush the snow from her skirt. "Wheat's not going anywhere till spring." "Neither am I," Eleanor said, and Walter, who was not a man given to smiling, allowed himself something close to one. What Walter did not know, and what Eleanor had not yet told anyone in Larkspur Hollow, was that she had grown up not merely keeping a mill's accounts, but understanding, in her hands and in her nose, and in the particular attention she paid to weather, the whole slow chemistry of grain. How a wheat strain bred too far south would blacken with rust in a wet Ohio spring. How a strain bred too far north would head out too late and freeze in the milk stage before the kernel hardened. How her father had spent 11 years crossing a turkey-red winter wheat brought over by German settlers with a hardier native strain until he found seed that would survive a false thaw in February without breaking dormancy too soon. Thomas Whitfield, in the last year of his life, had begun corresponding with an agricultural society in Manhattan, Kansas, about exactly this problem, because he had guessed, correctly, that Wyoming's true wealth was not going to stay locked forever inside cattle. And Eleanor had read every one of those letters twice, then a third time, then had begun, without telling him, to make her own notes in the margins of his ledger in a hand small enough that he might not notice for months that his wife understood the chemistry of dormant grain better than he did. She had never told him where the knowledge came from, because in the first months of their marriage she had been afraid, in the plain, unspoken way of a woman new to a household, that a wife who knew more than her husband about the one subject he was proudest of might unsettle something that did not need unsettling. It was a small dishonesty, the only one of her marriage, and she regretted it every time she opened the ledger after his death and found his careful, hopeful, half-informed notes about seed dormancy sitting beside a Whitfield family Bible with 60 years of births and deaths recorded in 6 different hands. She thought often, in those first cold weeks of widowhood, of the particular quality of the marriage she had actually had, as opposed to the one the newspaper notice might have promised a less clear-eyed bride. Thomas had never once told her he loved her, not in 11 months, not even in the last fevered days when a man given to sentiment might have reached for the word out of simple fear. And Eleanor had never told him either, and she had come to understand, in the months since his death, that the omission had not been coldness, but a kind of mutual honesty. Two practical people building something sturdier than declaration, brick by careful brick, the way Thomas himself had once described courting cattle buyers at the railhead. You don't win a fair price by telling a man how much you need the sale. You win it by showing him, plainly and without flourish, exactly what the stock is worth, and letting the number speak for itself. Their marriage had been conducted on much the same principle, and if it had lacked the fevered romance of a dime novel, it had possessed instead a steadiness Eleanor came to value more, in retrospect, than she suspected she would have valued passion, because steadiness, unlike passion, did not require constant tending to survive a hard season. She kept, that first winter, a private habit that she never fully explained even to Walter or Dell. Each evening after the ledger was closed, she walked out to the cottonwood on the rise where Thomas lay buried, regardless of weather, and stood there for exactly as long as it took to recite, silently, the full list of that day's completed chores, a habit that struck her, examined too closely, as a faintly foolish substitute for prayer. Though Reverend Kellerman, when she once confessed it to him, told her it was not so different from prayer as she supposed, that accounting honestly for a day's labor before the dead was, in his considerable experience, one of the oldest and most honest forms of grief a working person had ever devised, older by far than any formal liturgy the church itself had gotten around to writing down. The first of Larkspur Hollow's antagonists to make himself fully known that Winter was not Silas but Elias Vane, president of the Larkspur Hollow Trust and Savings Bank, a narrow man in his 50s with a gold watch chain he consulted more often than the conversation warranted, as if to remind whoever he was speaking with that his time was worth more than theirs. Vane held the mortgage note that Thomas had taken out 2 years earlier to buy the mule team and the seed drill for the wheat ground, $420 at 8%, due in full or in acceptable partial installments each first of the month. And in the second week of December he rode out to Bitter Creek Ranch himself rather than send the usual printed notice, which told Eleanor before he said a single word that something had shifted. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, seated stiffly in the parlor chair Eleanor had, in a small private rebellion, moved 6 inches closer to the stove than convention strictly required for a guest she did not wish to make too comfortable. "I want to be plain with you, because I find plainness saves everyone trouble in the end. Your husband's note is in good standing through this month, but a note held against a ranch with no male owner of record is a note the bank's board views with some concern, particularly with your brother-in-law expressing an interest in consolidating the 2 properties under his own name. I am not unsympathetic to your position. I am simply telling you what the board will ask me, come January, and I would rather you hear it from me in your own parlor than from a letter." "The note was made with Thomas," Eleanor said. "I am his heir and his executrix. The will is filed with the county clerk in Cheyenne." "Wills," Vane said, and there it was again, the same unhurried emphasis Silas had used on the word will, as though the two men had rehearsed the note between them. "Are filed, yes." Whether a widow's claim under a will survives a challenge from bloodkin is a question for a judge, not a banker, and judges in this territory do not ride circuit through Larkspur Hollow more than twice a year. "I would encourage you, Mrs. Whitfield, to consider an arrangement with Mr. Whitfield's brother before the matter becomes a legal one. Arrangements made in a parlor are almost always kinder than arrangements made in a courtroom." He left a printed statement of the note's balance on the table beside her untouched tea, and rode out before dark, and Eleanor sat a long while after he had gone, watching the fire, understanding with a coldness separate from the weather outside that Silas Whitfield's talk of a will's limits had not been a grieving brother's careless cruelty. It had been the opening move of something planned, and the banker's visit was the second move, and she did not yet know how many more there would be before the game revealed its whole shape. She met Jonah Cole 3 days later, on a morning so cold the creek had gone silent under its ice, when one of the ranch's 2 milk cows wandered through a broken section of fence and down toward the tree line along the water, and Eleanor, cursing under her breath in a manner Reverend Kellerman's wife would not have approved of, followed the animal's tracks nearly a mile before she found it standing placidly beside a man she had never met, who had already looped a length of rope around its neck and was leading it back toward the sound of her own approaching boots. "Figured somebody'd be along for her," the man said. He was perhaps 35, dressed for weather rather than appearance, with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of stillness in his manner that came, Eleanor would learn, from years spent trapping alone along the upper creeks, where a man who could not sit quiet for 6 hours at a stretch did not eat that winter. She was headed for your line shack. Cows are smarter about weather than most people give them credit for. "I'm obliged to you," Eleanor said, taking the rope. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Eleanor Whitfield." "Jonah Cole." "I've got a cabin up past the Second Fork, trapped this stretch of creek most winters, knew your husband a little, bought flour off him 2 autumns running before he put that ground into wheat instead. Sorry for your loss, ma'am. He was fairer than most in his dealings." There was nothing in the exchange that marked it, that first morning, as the beginning of anything beyond a neighborly kindness repaid with a word of thanks, and Eleanor walked the cow home turning over nothing more than gratitude and the ordinary business of mending fence before the ground froze harder. But Jonah Cole would return to Bitter Creek Ranch 11 more times before the spring thaw, first with a repaired trap he thought Walter might want, then with word of wolf sign along the north pasture, then, increasingly, without any errand at all that either of them named aloud, and each visit was a small deposit in an account neither of them was yet keeping track of on paper. The gossip began properly in the second week of January, carried into the mercantile and the chapel pews, the way gossip in a small town always traveled, by way of a woman who believed herself to be merely observant rather than cruel. Cora Whitfield had never liked Eleanor, not from the first Sunday she had seen her new sister-in-law in the chapel pew reading a farming pamphlet during the sermon instead of her hymnal, and widowhood had not softened the dislike so much as given it a new vocabulary. Standing at Otis Pruitt's counter-buying thread, in a voice pitched to carry to the 3 other women waiting their turn, Cora observed that it was peculiar, was it not, how a woman alone on a ranch that size managed to keep 2 hired men through a winter with wages barely paid, and peculiar, too, how she'd taken to riding out at odd hours, and did anyone recall that Trapper Cole had been seen at Bitter Creek more than once since the funeral, and of course she meant nothing by it, only that a widow ought to mind how things looked, for her own sake. Otis Pruitt, who weighed his thumb along with the flour, but was not by nature an unkind man, told Eleanor of the remark the next time she came into town for salt and coal oil, not to wound her, but because he judged, correctly, that a woman ought to know what was being said about her before it hardened into something believed rather than merely repeated. Eleanor received the news the way she received most unwelcome facts, by setting her jaw and asking a practical question. And do people believe her? Some do, Otis said, not unkindly. Small towns got nothing to spend its attention on in January but each other's business. Give it time, it'll blow past, long as you don't give it more to chew on. She gave it more to chew on within the month, though not by any doing of her own. Garrett Boone rode into Larkspur Hollow on the 9th of February, a man Eleanor had never met, but whose name she recognized instantly from a single mention in Thomas's ledger, underlined once, from an entry more than a year old. G. Boone came by again, asking after the north section. Told him same as before, not for sale. Boone was 29, well dressed for the territory in a way that suggested money from somewhere east of it, and he had, it emerged over the course of an uncomfortable half-hour in Eleanor's own parlor, spent the better part of 3 years before her marriage attempting to buy or otherwise acquire the north section of what was now Bitter Creek Ranch, on the theory, which he explained to her with the confidence of a man unused to being questioned, that the creek bottom there sat atop a vein of coal that would make whoever controlled it considerably wealthier than cattle or wheat ever would. Your husband was a stubborn man about that ground, Boone said, seated in the same parlor chair Vane had occupied 2 months before, as though the room had become a waiting station for men who believed they had some claim on her circumstances. I'll be plain with you, Mrs. Whitfield, since plainness seems to be the local custom. I'd intended, before Thomas married you, to make an offer for the section directly to him, and failing that, I'd have made an offer to marry into the property myself, had the timing gone differently. I don't say that to be indelicate. I say it because you ought to know your position is one other men have taken an interest in before, and will again, and I'd rather you hear a fair offer from me before you hear a worse one from your brother-in-law. I've had no offer from my brother-in-law, Eleanor said, though this was no longer entirely true, and I've no interest in one from you. The north section isn't for sale, Mr. Boone, and neither, I'll thank you to understand, am I. Boone left with the same unhurried courtesy Vane had shown, the courtesy of men who did not yet believe they could lose, and Eleanor stood at the window watching his horse recede down the frozen track and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, something closer to fear than grief. 3 men now, Silas, Vane, Boone, each circling the ranch from a different angle, each speaking to her with the same patient, proprietary calm, as though her ownership of Bitter Creek were a temporary inconvenience rather than a settled fact of law, and she did not yet understand how the 3 of them connected, only that they did, in some arrangement she could not yet see the shape of. She told no one the full extent of her worry, not Walter, not Dell, and certainly not Jonah Cole, who came by 2 days after Boone's visit with a haunch of venison and stayed longer than the errand required, sitting at her kitchen table while she worked at the ledger, asking her, in his unhurried way, what troubled her. "Nothing that concerns you," she said, and regretted the sharpness of it the moment she said it, because Jonah only nodded and did not press, which somehow made her want to tell him more than any pressing would have. "I've lived alone on this creek 11 years, he said instead, after a silence. Learned early that a man who says nothing troubles him usually means the opposite. I'm not asking you to unburden yourself to a near stranger, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm only saying, if the day comes you need a man who isn't Silas Whitfield, or that banker or the coal fellow from the east, there's a cabin up past the Second Fork that isn't going anywhere." It was the longest speech she had heard him give, and she found herself, against the caution that widowhood and 3 circling men had taught her to keep close, telling him about the note, and Vane's visit, and Silas's talk of wills, though she stopped short of mentioning Boone by name, or the coal beneath the north section, because some instinct told her that piece of information was worth more locked away than shared even with a man she was beginning, cautiously, to trust. Jonah listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said only, Whitfield's not a patient man. Patient men don't send a banker within a month of a funeral. He's moving fast because he's worried about something, and a worried man makes mistakes a patient one wouldn't. Watch for the mistake. She thought about that phrase for weeks afterward, watch for the mistake, turning it over the way she turned over a column of figures that would not quite balance, certain there was an error somewhere she had not yet found. She did not have to wait until spring to find it. She found it, instead, on the 11th of February, in the coldest week of that whole hard winter, when Silas Whitfield rode up to Bitter Creek Ranch a second time, this time with the folded paper from his coat pocket finally produced, and a proposition that would nearly cost Eleanor her life before the week was through. The weeks between Jonah's warning to watch for the mistake and Silas's second visit were not idle ones for any of the three men circling Bitter Creek, though Eleanor would not understand the full extent of their coordination until much later. Silas, it emerged afterward through Reverend Kellerman's own careful inquiries, had visited Elias Vane's office no fewer than 4 times in the last 2 weeks of January, and had sent, by the county's slow winter post, 2 letters to the Cheyenne attorney Harmon Slate, whose replies Silas kept folded inside his coat rather than in any drawer at home, unwilling to let Cora see the full shape of what he was arranging even as he continued to use her presence, and her occasional unkind remarks in the Mercantile, as a kind of cover for the more serious work proceeding underneath. Cora herself, for her part, had no knowledge of the forged writ that was even then being drafted, and would say so afterward, with a conviction Eleanor eventually came to believe, but her steady undermining of Eleanor's reputation through January, remarks about odd hours, and a trapper's frequent visits, repeated now not merely at the Mercantile counter, but in the chapel vestibule after Sunday service, had done real work of its own, softening the ground so that when Silas's writ finally arrived at Eleanor's door, fewer people in Larkspur Hollow were inclined to question its legitimacy or rush to a widow's defense than might otherwise have been the case in a town that still thought well of her. Reverend Kellerman was not among those whose opinion had softened, and it was in late January, 3 weeks before the blizzard, that he rode out to Bitter Creek Ranch himself, unbidden, to warn Eleanor of what he was hearing, a conversation that would matter a great deal in the weeks after the writ, though neither of them yet knew it. "I don't know what Silas Whitfield is building toward," Kellerman told her, seated not in the parlor chair but standing by the kitchen stove, having refused, with a small apologetic smile, to sit in what he called the visitor's chair. "But I know the shape of a man laying groundwork when I see one, and I've seen it in him since December. I'd ask you to keep careful account of every visit, every letter, every word spoken to you by Silas or that banker, dated and written down the day it happens, not from memory after. If trouble comes, and I begin to fear it will, a clear written record kept at the time is worth 10 times what memory can offer after the fact." It was advice Eleanor took seriously enough to begin a second, separate ledger that same week, a slim record of dates and conversations that she kept, deliberately, not in the house but in the seed shed behind the barn, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard, a precaution that struck her at the time as faintly foolish, the kind of thing a woman read about in dime novels rather than practiced in an actual Wyoming winter. And that would, within a month, prove to be the single most useful decision she made in the whole of that hard season, because it was this record, dated and specific, that Reverend Kellerman would later carry to Cheyenne alongside the court clerk's letter, giving the marshal's office a plain timeline of exactly how long Silas Whitfield had been building his case before he ever produced a forged document to enforce it. Elias Vane, meanwhile, sent 2 further printed notices that January, each one slightly more forceful in its language than the last, moving by careful degrees from a reminder of the note's terms to a pointed suggestion that the bank's board was, in his words, growing concerned about the security of its collateral given the property's uncertain title, language Eleanor now understood, reading it again after the blizzard with the benefit of hindsight, as a banker laying his own careful groundwork for a foreclosure he had likely discussed with Silas well before either man ever set foot on her porch. She answered each notice in writing, calm and precise, citing the note's actual terms and her own good standing against them. Letters that Vane never formally answered, but that she kept copies of in the same oilcloth bundle beneath the seed shed floor, a paper trail she was building without yet fully understanding how completely she would need it. It was against this backdrop of quiet accumulating pressure, three men each laying a different piece of groundwork through the coldest weeks of January, that Silas rode up for the second time on the 11th of February, and Eleanor, watching him dismount with that same folded paper finally visible in his coat pocket, understood, before he had said a single word, that whatever had been building through the whole of that month had finally arrived at its intended hour. The paper Silas produced that afternoon was a copy of a Wyoming Territory statute, or rather a lawyer's letter summarizing one, procured, Eleanor would later learn, from a Cheyenne attorney named Harmon Slate, whom Silas had paid $11 to find whatever thin legal thread might be pulled to unravel her claim. The letter argued, in dense and confident language, that under territorial law, a widow's dower right entitled her to occupancy and a portion of income from her deceased husband's estate, but that clear title and the right to encumber or improve the land, including the wheat ground Thomas had broken from grazing acreage without formal survey amendment, remained properly vested in the nearest male blood relation, absent an explicitly notarized deed of gift, which Thomas's will, drafted hastily by Reverend Kellerman rather than a territorial lawyer, did not in Slate's opinion sufficiently provide. "I don't say this to be unkind," Silas said, and Eleanor had by now come to recognize that sentence as the reliable herald of the unkindest thing he had yet to say. "I say it because Slate is a fair lawyer, and this letter is fair warning. You can fight this in Cheyenne, if you've got the money for a circuit court case and the patience to wait 2 years for a docket date, during which time this banknote comes due, and Vane forecloses on the whole property for want of payment, leaving nothing for either of us. Or you can sign this ranch over to me now, take a fair sum, and go back to your sisters with your dignity and your savings intact. I'm your family, Eleanor. Whatever you think of me, I'm trying to spare you a fight you can't win. You're trying to take what my husband built," Eleanor said, "and dress the taking up as kindness. I won't sign anything, Silas. Take your letter to Cheyenne yourself if you believe in it." Something shifted in his face then, some final patience giving way, and he stood and put his hat back on with a deliberateness that frightened her more than anything he had yet said. "I gave you the chance to do this easy," he said. "The winter's not done yet, Eleanor. Things happen to isolated houses in a bad winter. I'd think on that, if I were you, before the next storm comes through." She told herself afterward that she had misheard the threat in it, that grief and cold and 3 months of circling men had made her hear menace in what might have been only a bitter man's parting shot, and it was this doubt, more than any lack of caution, that left her unprepared 8 days later when the blizzard came down off the mountains, without the 2 days' warning a Wyoming winter usually gave. Walter and Dell had ridden to town for supplies and been caught there by the first hard hour of it, wise enough to shelter at the livery rather than risk the ranch road blind, which meant that when 3 men rode up to the house at dusk on the 12th of February, lanterns already lit against the coming dark, Eleanor Whitfield was alone. She recognized Silas first, and then, with a small cold drop in her stomach, Elias Vane beside him, and a third man she did not know, broad and silent, whom Silas introduced only as a deputy sent from the county to serve a writ. The writ, when Silas read it aloud at her own door with the wind already rising behind him, claimed that the banknote was in default, that an emergency injunction had been granted by a Cheyenne judge pending the outcome of the title dispute, and that Eleanor Whitfield was to vacate the premises of Bitter Creek Ranch that same evening, the property to be held in trust by Silas Whitfield until the courts resolved the underlying claim. It was, Eleanor would learn many weeks later, an almost entirely fraudulent document, the injunction backdated, and the judge's signature forged by Harmon Slate for a further sum Silas had paid him, banking correctly on the fact that no widow alone in a blizzard would have the means or the time to verify a Cheyenne court filing before the paper's authority had already accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. But standing at her own door with the wind screaming down off the rise and a deputy's badge catching lantern light beside her brother-in-law's face, Eleanor had no way to know the paper was false, only that 3 men stood between her and any recourse, and that behind them the sky to the northwest had gone the flat, bruised color that meant the storm was already closer than the wind's first gusts suggested. "You can't mean to put me out tonight," she said, and heard, for the first time since Thomas's death, something like pleading in her own voice, which she hated. "There's a blizzard coming. Let me shelter till morning, at least, and I'll go to town peaceable." "The writ says tonight," Silas said, and would not meet her eyes when he said it, which told her, even then, that some part of him understood exactly what he was doing. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Eleanor. I truly am. But the law's the law." They did not put her out into open country, not quite, not with a deputy present to witness the shape of the thing, but they escorted her, with her canvas satchel and the wool coat she managed to snatch from its peg, to the old line shack 1.5 miles north along the creek, a one-room hunting cabin Thomas had used for spring roundup and left unstocked for winter. Its stove flue half-collapsed from a summer storm and never repaired, its woodpile bare, and left her there with the storm's first serious snow already slanting sideways past the lantern light as they rode back toward the warm house that had, until that morning, been hers. The line shack's flue was choked with a summer's nest of pack rat debris, and the first hour Eleanor spent inside it was spent not in despair, but in the particular, focused calm that came over her whenever a problem presented itself as a sequence of solvable parts rather than a single overwhelming fact. A calm she had learned at 9 years old, watching her father work through a jammed grinding stone 1 gear at a time instead of cursing the whole machine. She cleared the flue with the bone-handled knife and her bare fingers until they bled, found 4 split logs Thomas had once left stacked beneath the shack's low eave against just such an emergency and forgotten to replenish, and coaxed a fire from them with the flint striker she always carried, out of a habit her father had drilled into her in the satchel's inner pocket. The fire caught, guttered, caught again, and held, and by the time full dark came down, she had a small hard core of heat in a cabin that was losing warmth through its ill-fitted boards faster than 4 logs could replace it. She did not sleep that first night so much as ration her own attention between the fire and the cold, feeding the flames in careful increments to make 4 logs last until dawn, and in the long hours between feedings she found herself, half from cold-numbed instinct and half from the same stubbornness that had answered a rancher's 4-sentence letter 3 years before, unwrapping the wool from around her mother's sourdough jar and tucking it inside her own coat, against her body, the way she had once seen a Zanesville midwife warm a chilled infant, because some buried, half-conscious part of her understood that the starter, a living culture of wild yeast her mother had carried across a river and kept alive through 11 Ohio winters by exactly this method, body heat borrowed and given back, would die in a night this cold left on a shelf, and that losing it would be a second death laid on top of the first, one she was not yet ready to permit. By the second day the storm had not broken, and Eleanor understood, working the arithmetic of it with the same cold clarity she brought to Thomas's ledgers, that 4 logs and a body's warmth would not carry her through a second night without more fuel, and that the woodpile Thomas had meant to replenish did not exist. She broke apart the shack's single rickety table for kindling. She stripped bark from the leeward side of 2 nearby pines with the knife, moving in short bursts between the cabin and the trees to keep from staying out in the wind longer than her hands could bear, and she rationed what little hardtack and dried venison remained in the shack's single shelf, a store some previous roundup hand had left behind and forgotten, into portions small enough to last 4 days rather than the 1 day a hungrier woman might have taken. She thought, In the emptier hours, of Silas's face not meeting hers at the door, and of Vane's watch chain, and of the forged confidence of a letter she could not yet prove was false, and she found that the anger these thoughts produced was more useful to her than despair would have been, because anger kept her moving, and despair, she suspected, was exactly what 3 circling men had been counting on to finish the job the cold did not. Jonah Cole found her on the morning of the 3rd day, not by search so much as by the accumulated instinct of a man who had trapped that creek 11 winters and understood its every fold well enough to know that a storm of this severity would have driven anyone caught out in it toward one of 3 shelters, and who had, moreover, ridden past Bitter Creek Ranch on the storm's first evening to find the house dark, and Silas Whitfield's tracks, already half erased by snow, leading north instead of east, toward his own spread, a detail that had troubled him enough to keep him from sleeping easy through 2 nights of weather that would have killed a less careful man for less good reason. He broke the line shack's frozen door with his shoulder and found Eleanor upright by a fire reduced to coals, wrapped in every piece of cloth the cabin had contained, a wool-swaddled jar tucked against her ribs beneath her coat as though it were a child, and though her lips were cracked and her hands would not fully close for 2 more days, she was, against every reasonable expectation the storm had set for her, alive. "They left you here," Jonah said, not a question, kneeling to check her hands and her feet for the white, waxy patches of frostbite, with a competence that told her this was not the first time he had done this for someone caught out in weather that should have killed them. Silas, and who else? "Vane," she said, through a jaw too stiff to shape the words easily, "and a deputy. There was a writ, injunction. They said the note was in default." "There's no circuit judge within 140 miles this time of year," Jonah said, low, and something in his voice had gone very flat and very cold. Colder, Eleanor thought later, than the storm itself. "No judge signs an emergency injunction in February with the passes closed. That paper's a lie, and I intend to prove it's a lie before the ground thaws enough to bury whoever wrote it, if it comes to that." He carried her, when her legs would not yet hold her reliably, the 1.5 miles to his own cabin past the Second Fork, rather than risk the longer ride to town in weather still throwing intermittent squalls, and it was there, over the following 8 days of recovery, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and cured hide, fed broth Jonah made from the same venison haunch he had brought her weeks before, that Eleanor Whitfield made the decision that would, in time, remake not only her own fortune but the fortune of the whole town that had, until that winter, mostly overlooked her. She would not go back to Ohio, she would not sign anything Silas Whitfield put in front of her. And she would prove, with the same patient arithmetic her father had taught her over a jammed grinding stone, that the land Thomas Whitfield had left her was not merely defensible, but capable of a wealth none of the 3 men circling it, not Silas with his cattle, not Vane with his mortgage percentages, not Boone with his coal seam, had yet imagined. The first 5 nights at Jonah's cabin passed mostly in a silence Eleanor was grateful for, her body too depleted by cold and hunger to manage much conversation beyond what the recovery itself required, and it was in that silence that she came to notice, more clearly than she might have in ordinary circumstances, the particular character of the man who had carried her 1.5 miles through drifted snow without once mentioning the effort as anything remarkable. Jonah did not ask her to recount the blizzard in detail during those first days, did not press her for the story of Silas and Vane, and the forged writ before she was ready to give it, and instead occupied himself with the practical business of her recovery, boiling broth, checking her hands each morning for the creeping white patches that would have meant amputation had they spread, and mending, without being asked, the strap of her canvas satchel, which had torn somewhere in the worst hour of the second night, and which she had not even noticed was broken until she found it whole again on the 4th morning, set quietly beside her boots. It was the folding knife, more than any words exchanged between them, that first told Eleanor something true about the shape of what was growing between herself and this quiet, careful man. On the fifth evening, strong enough by then to sit upright at his table rather than remain wrapped in blankets by the fire, she had taken the bone-handled knife from her satchel to clean it, the same knife that had cleared the line shack's choked flue and stripped bark from 2 pines in the worst hour of the storm, and Jonah, watching her work the blade against a whetstone with a competence he had clearly not expected from a rancher's widow, asked her, in his unhurried way, where she'd learned to keep an edge that fine. "My father taught me," she said a mill's got more moving iron in it than most farms, and a woman who can't keep her own tools sharp is a woman waiting on someone else's convenience to get her work done. He didn't believe in raising daughters who had to wait on anyone. "Sounds like a man I'd have liked to know," Jonah said, and there was nothing performed in the way he said it, no courting flattery, only the plain observation of one careful person recognizing the shape of another, and Eleanor, turning the blade over in the firelight, understood that this was the first moment since Thomas's death that she had felt, however briefly, something closer to hope than to mere survival. She told Jonah Cole the whole of it on the 6th night in his cabin, when her hands had healed enough to hold a cup without trembling, and the worst of the storm's aftermath had passed from the sky, if not yet from the drifted roads. She told him about her father's mill in Zanesville, and the 11 years he had spent crossing Turkey red wheat with a hardier native strain to find seed that would survive a false February thaw, and about the notebooks she had kept since she was 12 years old, recording which strains headed out too early and which held dormant too long. Knowledge she had never spoken aloud to anyone in Larkspur Hollow, because a mail-order bride who arrived already knowing more about wheat than the husband who'd advertised for her seemed, in the raw early days of a marriage built on a newspaper notice, like a thing that might unbalance whatever fragile arrangement they were building. He never knew the whole of it, she said, watching the fire rather than Jonah's face, because it was easier to say the truth to flame than to a man's expression. I let him believe the notes in his ledger were mine because I'd learned from watching him, not because I already knew the answers before he did. It was a small lie. I've regretted it since the day he died, because there wasn't time left to correct it. He'd have been glad of it, Jonah said, knowing a wife who could finish the work he started. Man who plows against the whole county's advice isn't a man threatened by a wife who knows more about the plowing than he does. I only met him a handful of times, but I'd wager that much on it. It was the first time since Thomas's death that anyone had offered her that particular comfort, not sympathy for her loss, but a plain, considered opinion about the character of the man she had lost. And Eleanor found herself, in the firelight of a trapper's cabin, 1.5 miles from the ranch, that 3 men were trying to take from her, telling Jonah the rest of what she knew. About the coal Boone believed lay beneath the north section, about Vane's talk of default and foreclosure, about the strange, coordinated patience of 3 men who each seemed to be waiting for the others to finish some piece of a larger plan before making their own move. "They're not working together exactly," Jonah said slowly, turning the pieces over the way he turned over trap sign, reading a story from tracks other men would have walked past. "They're working around each other. Vane wants the note paid, or the land foreclosed, doesn't much care which, long as the bank profits either way. Boone wants the coal seam and doesn't care who owns the rest of it, so long as he gets that one section. Silas wants the whole thing, house and all, because he's spent 10 years watching his brother do better with less, and that's not a debt money settles. 3 different hungers all pointed the same direction this winter because a widow alone looked like the easiest ground to take it from. That forged writ was Silas's move, and it was a mistake, same as I told you a worried man makes. A legitimate claim doesn't need a forged judge's signature. Find the forgery, prove it, and the whole structure he's built comes down, because a man caught forging a court document doesn't get a second hearing on anything else he's claimed. It took them the better part of 3 weeks, once the roads opened enough for travel, to build that proof, weeks in which Eleanor stayed at Jonah's cabin rather than return to a ranch Silas had, in her absence, installed his own hired man to watch over, on the theory, correctly guessed by Jonah, that Silas assumed the blizzard had either killed her outright or driven her back to Ohio, and had not yet learned otherwise. Reverend Kellerman once told the full account, rode to Cheyenne himself at his own expense to inquire after the supposed injunction, and returned with written confirmation from the territorial court clerk that no such filing existed, that no judge named on the writ had presided over any Larkspur Hollow matter that winter, and that the signature Slate had forged belonged to a judge who had, as it happened, been in Denver attending his daughter's wedding on the date the writ claimed he had signed it in Cheyenne, a detail so specific and so easily disproven that Eleanor understood, reading it, exactly how confident Silas had been that no one would ever bother to check. It was during this same stretch of weeks, going through Thomas's strongbox with Reverend Kellerman as witness to establish a full accounting of the estate, that Eleanor found the second document that would, in the end, matter more than the forged writ itself. The original homestead patent for the 1,140 acres of Bitter Creek Ranch, issued by the General Land Office in 1874 under the Homestead Act, 5 years before their marriage but proved up, the residency and improvement requirements finally satisfied only in the spring after their wedding, and filed, in Thomas's own quiet, unannounced decision, jointly in both their names, Thomas Whitfield and Eleanor Whitfield, as the law in such cases of proving up during marriage in fact required, a detail Silas's Cheyenne lawyer had either not known or had gambled Eleanor herself would never discover. It meant, Reverend Kellerman explained to her, his hands not quite steady with the weight of what he was reading, that Eleanor Whitfield was not merely an heir under a hastily drafted will, vulnerable to a blood relations challenge, but a direct co-holder of federal land title, a fact no territorial court, however sympathetic to Silas Whitfield's grievances, could unmake. "He never told you," Kellerman said quietly, and Eleanor, reading her own name in her dead husband's careful square hand on a federal patent she had not known existed, understood at last why Thomas had written, in that ledger she had read 100 times since his death, "The land tells you what it wants if you are patient enough to let it finish the sentence," and understood, too, with a grief sharper than any she had felt at the graveside, that Thomas Whitfield had been protecting her from exactly this winter before he had any reason to believe he would not be there to see her through it himself. They rode into Larkspur Hollow together on the 2nd of March, Eleanor, Jonah, and Reverend Kellerman, with the court clerk's letter and the homestead patent, both wrapped in oilcloth against the last of the winter's damp, and went first not to the ranch but to the bank, where Elias Vane sat behind his desk, consulting his watch chain with the same unhurried confidence he had brought to Eleanor's parlor in December, a confidence that did not survive the reading of the court clerk's letter aloud in his own office, with Otis Pruitt and 2 other townsmen summoned by Kellerman as witnesses standing in the doorway to hear it. "I want to be plain with you, Mr. Vane," Eleanor said, and found that the words came easier now than they had all winter, because plainness seems to be the local custom. "I hold clear federal title to Bitter Creek Ranch, proved and filed 5 years ago, in both my name and my late husband's. The writ you helped serve on me in a blizzard was forged, and the judge whose signature was forged to it was 200 miles away at the time, a fact any clerk in Cheyenne can confirm within the hour. I don't know how much you knew of the forgery when you rode out with Silas that night. I'd like to believe, for your own sake, that it was less than everything. But the note on this ranch will be paid in full, on schedule, as it always would have been, and I'll thank you not to visit my parlor again unless it's to apologize." Vane's face, in the telling Eleanor gave many times in later years, had gone the color of old ash, and he had said very little beyond a stiff assurance that the bank had acted only on documentation presented to it in good faith, an assurance nobody in the room, least of all Otis Pruitt, quite believed. Whatever private arrangement had existed between Vane and Silas, Whatever the banker had known or guessed about the forged injunction's true provenance, he did not survive the telling of it with his reputation intact, and within the year the bank's board, embarrassed by the whole affair once it became town knowledge, would quietly arrange for Vane's early retirement to a nephew's ranch in Nebraska, a consequence proportional enough, Eleanor thought, without being anything so satisfying as punishment. Silas Whitfield they found at his own spread that same afternoon, and it was there, in his own yard, with Cora watching from the porch, that Eleanor laid the homestead patent on the tailgate of his wagon and told him, without raising her voice, that the ranch was hers by federal law that no Cheyenne lawyer's letter could unmake. That the writ he had served her was a forgery she had proof enough to see him prosecuted for if she chose, and that she did not choose it, not out of mercy exactly, but because a trial would cost her a season she could not spare, and would accomplish nothing a signed and witnessed confession could not accomplish faster. "You'll sign a statement," she told him, "admitting the writ was false, and you'll return the hired man you've had squatting on my land these 3 weeks, and you'll leave Bitter Creek Ranch and everyone on it alone from this day forward. If you do that, I won't press charges that could see you in a territorial prison. If you don't, Reverend Kellerman here has already written to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, and that letter goes out on tomorrow's stage regardless of what you decide today." Silas looked, for a long moment, not at Eleanor but at the patent on the tailgate, at his own dead brother's handwriting beside a stranger's, and something in his broad shoulders seemed to fold inward, the particular deflation of a man who has spent a whole campaign convinced of his own inevitable victory, suddenly confronted with the fact of his defeat. He signed the statement Kellerman had drafted. He did not apologize, not that day, not for a long while afterward, but Cora, watching from the porch with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, said nothing unkind that afternoon for the first time since Thomas's funeral, and Eleanor would remember, months later, that this small silence had been the first small crack in a dislike that would not fully mend for years, but that had, on that cold March afternoon, at least stopped actively widening. The marshal's office in Cheyenne, once Reverend Kellerman's letter and the court clerk's confirmation reached them, did not treat the matter lightly. Whatever private arrangement Eleanor had made with Silas about withholding her own charges against him, because a forged judicial signature was a federal matter regardless of any private forgiveness a wronged party chose to extend, and Harmon Slate, the Cheyenne attorney who had drafted both the misleading dower rights letter and the outright forged injunction, found himself by April disbarred from practice in the territory and facing a grand jury indictment that would, within the year, send him to serve 18 months in the territorial prison at Laramie, a consequence Eleanor had not sought directly but did not mourn either, understanding that a man willing to forge a judge's signature for $11 and the promise of more business from a client like Silas Whitfield represented a danger to every widow and every uncertain claim across the whole territory, not merely to her own. Eleanor testified once, by written deposition rather than in person, in the matter of the territory against Harmon Slate, a deposition Reverend Kellerman helped her draft with the same careful precision he had brought to his own inquiries in Cheyenne, and it was reading that deposition years later, kept among the mill's own historical papers, that Eleanor Voss would find the plainest single account her great-grandmother ever gave of the blizzard itself, stripped of the softer narrative shape it had taken by the time it became a family story told at Christmas gatherings. "I was left at a line shack with an unrepaired flue, 4 logs of wood, and provisions sufficient for perhaps 2 days, in a storm that did not break for 3, the deposition read, in Eleanor's own plain, unembellished hand. I do not know whether the men who left me there expected me to die, or merely did not trouble themselves to consider the question closely enough to care either way. I have since concluded that the distinction between those two failures matters less than it might seem to, since the result, absent Mr. Cole's intervention, would have been identical either way. Spring came late that year, as it often did after a hard winter, but when it came Eleanor was ready for it, in a way no one in Larkspur Hollow, save perhaps Jonah Cole, had expected a widow of 24 to be. She planted the wheat ground on the rise above the creek, not merely with the seed Thomas had sown the autumn before, which had survived the winter's brutal cold in dormant health precisely because of the strain her father had spent 11 years perfecting, but with a second, larger planting on ground she had Walter and Dell break fresh from grazing acreage along the creek bottom, 40 additional acres she paid for by selling, over Silas's now chastened objections, a portion of the cattle herd that even he privately admitted the ranch had never had quite enough grass to properly support. "You're betting the whole spring on wheat," Walter said to her in April, not quite a question, watching her walk the new broken furrows with the same attentive patience she had shown all winter, kneeling every 100 yards or so to test the tilth of the soil between her fingers. "I'm betting on what the land's already told us it wants," Eleanor said. "Same as Thomas did, only I've got 11 years of my father's notes behind the wager instead of guesswork. This creek bottom drains cold and slow, which is exactly the kind of ground Turkey Red wants. The county's wrong that this is cattle country and nothing else. It's cattle country because nobody's yet planted the right seed in the right ground and given it a fair season to prove itself." She proved it that August, when the 40 new acres came in heavier than any wheat yet grown in that stretch of the territory, the heads full and hard and largely untouched by the rust that had blighted a smaller experimental planting 2 counties over that same summer, a difference in outcome that word of mouth, moving through Larkspur Hollow the way gossip always had, carried to every rancher who had once told Thomas Whitfield that a man who plowed grass for grain did not understand where he lived. Otis Pruitt was the first to ask, standing in his own mercantile with a sample of the grain weighed on his own scale, whether Mrs. Whitfield might consider selling seed rather than only grain, and it was this single question, asked almost idly across a countertop in early September, that planted in Eleanor the idea that would occupy the next 3 years of her life and, in time, remake the whole economy of the town. She did not build the mill all at once, and the story of its construction, as she would later tell her own children, was less a single triumphant decision than 100 small ones stacked one on top of another the way a wall is built one course of stone at a time. The first winter after the wheat came in, she used the profit from that first heavy harvest not to expand the herd Silas had once tried to buy from her, but to order, at considerable expense freighted in by wagon from the rail line at Cheyenne, a set of French burr millstones her father had once told her were the only stones worth grinding fine flour with, stones that arrived in April wrapped in straw and canvas like something sacred, and that Walter and Dell, with help from 2 of Jonah's trapping partners hired on for cash wages, spent 6 weeks setting into a stone foundation Eleanor had them build into the creek bank itself, where the water ran fast enough over a natural drop to turn a wheel without the expense of damming. The millstones themselves, once they arrived from Cheyenne wrapped in their straw and canvas, sat crated in the barn for the better part of 6 weeks before Eleanor would allow anyone to touch them, because she had learned from her father that a burr stone improperly seated in its foundation would grind unevenly for the whole of its working life, throwing off flour of inconsistent grade no baker could reliably depend on, and she was not willing to build a reputation for Bitter Creek flour on stones set in haste. She spent those 6 weeks instead walking the creek bank with Walter and a hired surveyor from Cheyenne, a careful, soft-spoken man named Aldous Reyes who had built mills in Kansas before the railroad work drew him west, marking and remarking the exact point where the water's natural drop would turn a wheel with the least waste of current, testing the creek bed's bearing capacity with iron rods driven a full 6 feet into the gravel before either man would agree the foundation stones could safely be laid above them. "Your father would have liked this part," Jonah told her one cold April morning, watching her kneel at the creek's edge, testing the flow with a length of cord and a cork float, timing its passage with her own pocket watch, a habit she had picked up from Reyes and adopted immediately as her own. "The part where knowing a thing properly matters more than getting it done quick. He used to say a mill built in a hurry is a mill you spend the rest of your life apologizing for, Eleanor said, not looking up from the float's slow passage down the current. I don't intend to spend the rest of mine apologizing for anything I can help. The Foundation, once Reyes pronounced it sound, took Walter, Dell, and the 2 hired trapping partners Jonah brought in nearly 4 more weeks to lay, working stone by stone through a wet Wyoming April that turned the creek bank to mud more days than not. And it was during this stretch of hard physical labor, more than in any of the courtroom drama of the winter before, that Larkspur Hollow's opinion of Eleanor Whitfield began its slower, steadier turn, because a town that had spent a winter gossiping about a widow's odd hours could not help but notice, watching wagon after wagon of quarried stone hauled out to Bitter Creek through a wet spring, that whatever else might be said of her, she was building something real, with her own hands as much as anyone's, in plain daylight where the whole county could watch her do it. Otis Pruitt extended credit that spring on freight charges Eleanor could not yet cover outright, a kindness he explained gruffly when she thanked him for it, by saying only that he'd weighed enough of Thomas Whitfield's grain honestly over the years to trust the son's ledgers would settle fair with his widow's, and that a mill on Bitter Creek meant a mercantile that no longer had to wait on unreliable freight wagons from Cheyenne for its own flour stock. A practical calculation dressed lightly in the language of trust, though Eleanor understood, accepting the credit, that it was trust all the same, the first real extension of it the town had offered her since Thomas's funeral. By the time the wheel first turned in May of 1881, the mill's construction had cost Eleanor very nearly the whole of 2 harvests' profit, a sum that would have frightened a less carefully calculating woman into abandoning the project halfway through, and she said as much to Jonah on the evening the wheel first caught the current, standing on the bank watching the spray catch the last light exactly as that long labor would later be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Though even in that moment of accomplishment she was already turning over, in the same patient arithmetic that had carried her through the blizzard, the next season's figures, the cost of grinding stone's eventual wear, the price of good seed wheat for the following spring's expanded planting, the slow accumulating math of an enterprise built to outlast any single year's fortune, good or bad. Jonah Cole, by the second spring, was no longer merely a neighbor who found stray cows and brought venison at convenient intervals. He had sold off most of his trapping interests, a trade that was thinning anyway as beaver prices fell and the upper creeks grew quieter of fur each season, and had taken instead to working alongside Walter and Dell at Bitter Creek, first for wages, then, as the mill neared completion, and the 2 of them had spent enough long evenings at the kitchen table over ledgers and millstone diagrams to have stopped pretending the arrangement was purely a business one, without any wages at all beyond a standing that neither of them had yet put a formal name to. It was Jonah who finally said the plain thing, on an evening in May when the mill's water wheel turned for the first time and threw a fine cold spray up into the last of the daylight, both of them standing on the bank watching it catch and hold the current the way Eleanor's father's mill had once caught and held the Muskingum River 1,000 miles east. "You don't need to marry me for the mill to keep turning," Jonah said, watching the wheel rather than her. In the careful sideways manner she had come to understand was how he said the things that mattered most to him. "I want to say that plain so you never wonder later if I asked for the wrong reason. I'm asking because I've spent 2 years finding excuses to ride down this creek that had less and less to do with stray cows, and I'd like to stop pretending otherwise." She had turned the question over for 3 days before answering him, not from any doubt about her own feeling, but from the same careful habit of mind that made her test a creek's flow with a cork float before trusting a millwright's foundation to it, wanting to be certain, before she gave an answer that would reshape the whole remaining shape of her life, that she was choosing Jonah Cole for himself, and not merely for the steady, unglamorous safety he represented after a winter that had taught her how quickly safety could be taken away by men who only pretended to offer it. She walked the wheat ground alone on the second of those 3 mornings, the same ground where she had once knelt in December testing frozen furrows with her bare palm, and found, turning the question over against the plain evidence of every ordinary kindness Jonah had shown her since the morning he'd led a stray cow back through the trees, that the answer had in fact been settled for some while already, and that the 3 days had been less deliberation than simple courage gathering itself to say a true thing aloud. "I don't need you to keep the mill turning," Eleanor agreed, and found, saying it, that the plain, unromantic honesty of the exchange suited her better than any declaration Boone or 100 other men might have offered. "I'd like you here regardless of the mill, Jonah. That's a different thing, and it's the truer one." They married in the Larkspur Hollow Chapel in June of 1881, with the cracked bell ringing its same off note over a congregation considerably larger and considerably warmer toward the bride than the one that had watched her marry a stranger 2.5 years before, and if it was not the kind of romance the dime novels back east liked to print, it was, Eleanor thought, watching Jonah's steady, unhurried face across the altar, something more durable than romance, the particular trust of two people who had already been tested by a blizzard and a forged writ and 3 years of hard practical work, and had chosen each other anyway, with clear eyes and no illusions left to lose. The 2 years between the mill's first turning and the drought that tested it were not, in Eleanor's own later recollection, years of unbroken ease, though they were the closest thing to settled contentment she had known since her father's mill in Zanesville had still been solvent and her mother still living. The work of those years was steady rather than dramatic. Walter Pruitt, whose own wife had died of consumption back in Missouri before he ever came west, courted and married Delphine Marsh, a widow who ran the town's small dressmaking trade, in the spring of 1882, and it was Delphine, more than any other single person besides Eleanor herself, who first learned the full craft of the bread ovens, standing beside Eleanor through that whole first winter of the communal baking arrangement, learning to read the color of a crust and the sound a loaf made when tapped on its underside, the way Eleanor had once learned to read the tilth of wheat ground between her fingers. Del Ashby, the 19-year-old who had come west from Missouri with nothing but a horse and an unnamed debt, stayed on at Bitter Creek through those years as well, saving his wages with a discipline that surprised even Walter, until by 1884 he had enough set aside to buy 40 acres of his own creek-bottom ground 2 miles downstream, ground he planted, at Eleanor's direct instruction and with a portion of her own seed stock, in the same turkey red wheat that had by then made Bitter Creek's name known as far as the rail depot at Cheyenne. Eleanor kept, through those same years, a private practice she never fully explained to anyone but Jonah. On the first Sunday evening of every month, after the ledgers were closed and the children, once there were children, had been put to bed, she would take down her father's old notebooks, the ones she had carried in her memory more than in any physical page for the first years of her marriage to Thomas, and copy a portion of them by hand into a fresh notebook of her own, adding her own observations from that month's weather and that season's yield beside her father's original entries from a river 1,000 miles east. A slow accumulating record that would, by the time she began teaching the School of Milling formally in 1890, run to 4 thick volumes and would become, in time, the single most consulted reference any woman in that stretch of the territory had for understanding which grain would hold against which winter. It was tedious work, copying by lamplight what she had already half memorized, and she never fully explained to Jonah why she kept at it so faithfully, even in the years when the mill itself required none of the added labor, until one evening in 1883, watching her bent over the notebook with Ruth asleep in a cradle beside the stove, he asked her outright. "It's not really for the mill," she admitted, setting down her pen. "It's so that if anything ever happens to me, the way it happened to Thomas, sudden and before its season, there's a record plain enough that Ruth, or whoever comes after her, doesn't have to guess at what I knew, the way I had to guess, some of it, working out Thomas's half-finished notes after he was gone. I don't want anyone I love standing in a cold kitchen someday trying to reconstruct from memory what I could have simply written down while I still had the evenings to spare for it." Jonah said nothing for a long moment, then crossed the room and put another log on the stove without being asked, a small, unspoken agreement that the lamp could burn a while longer that night, and Eleanor understood it, as she had come to understand most of what passed between them, as its own kind of answer. The drought came in the summer of 1883, the second dry summer running after a winter that had brought barely half its usual snowpack down off the Laramie Range, and by July the Bitter Creek itself had thinned to a channel a man could nearly step across in places that had run chest-deep in springs past, a scarcity that touched every ranch and every field in the county, but touched none so visibly as the cattle operations that had no wheat ground's deep-rooted resilience to fall back on. Silas Whitfield's herd, run on grass alone across land that had never recovered its full carrying capacity since the drought began, lost 11 head that summer to a combination of thirst and the poor forage that came with it, a loss that would have been merely painful in an ordinary year, and was, in a year when the banknote on his own mortgage spread came due in September, very nearly ruinous. It was the kind of reversal that might, in a less carefully built story than the one Eleanor had spent 4 years constructing, have produced in Silas nothing but a fresh round of resentment, and for a few weeks in August it did produce exactly that, a bitter muttering around the mercantile that his brother's widow sat fat on a full granary while decent cattlemen went under, muttering that reached Eleanor's ears by way of Otis Pruitt, just as the earlier gossip once had. But the drought that broke Silas's herd was the same drought that proved, beyond any argument the county's established ranchers could any longer sustain, the wisdom of the wheat Thomas Whitfield had first planted against everyone's advice, and Eleanor had since perfected past even his own hopes for it. The deep-rooted turkey red strain, bred across 11 of her father's careful years for exactly this kind of dry, cold country stress, came through the drought summer, with a yield reduced but far from ruined, while grass-fed cattle across the whole county thinned toward starvation, and it was this contrast, plain and undeniable to anyone who rode the county roads that August, that finally silenced the old argument that Wyoming Territory was cattle country and nothing else. The crisis that truly tested what Eleanor had built, though, was not the drought's effect on her own harvest, which came through lean but sound, but its effect on the town of Larkspur Hollow itself, where by September the freight wagons that ordinarily brought in flour from the rail depot at Cheyenne had grown erratic and expensive, the whole territory's grain supply strained by a drought that had touched 3 counties at once, and Otis Pruitt's mercantile shelves had gone bare of flour for the better part of 6 weeks, a scarcity that fell hardest on the town's poorer families, the widows and the laborers and the homesteaders on thin marginal ground who had no cattle herd or wheat ground of their own to fall back on. It was Reverend Kellerman who first came to Eleanor with the shape of the problem, sitting in the same parlor chair Vane and Boone and Silas had each once occupied, though this time with a very different errand. "There are 11 families in this town," Kellerman told her, "who will not have bread on their tables by November if something doesn't change, and I've exhausted what the church's own poor relief can offer. I don't come asking for charity exactly, Mrs. Cole, because I know charity's not a thing you've ever had much patience for. I come asking whether a mill that ground 400 bushels of good wheat this summer might have 400 bushels worth of flour to spare at a price a laborer's family could still meet, before winter makes the question urgent instead of merely difficult." Eleanor did not answer him that afternoon with charity, exactly, because Jonah's assessment of her, that she had no great patience for charity as such, was not wrong, but she answered him with something that would, in the years that followed, prove more durable than charity and considerably more transformative for the town. She proposed, and within a month had built, a communal grinding and baking arrangement at the mill itself, wherein any family in the county could bring their own grain, however small the amount, to be ground at a fair fixed toll, rather than the variable and often exploitative rates the freight-hauled flour had commanded, and where, on 2 mornings a week, using ovens Eleanor had Walter and Dell build into a long, low addition off the mill's grinding room, she and 3 other women from town, recruited and taught over that first hard autumn, baked bread from the mill's own flour, using, at the very center of every batch, a spoonful of starter drawn from the same jar Eleanor had carried against her body through the worst night of the blizzard 4 years before. A starter that had, by then, leavened bread for half the families in Larkspur Hollow, and had become, without anyone quite deciding to make it so, a kind of quiet emblem of the whole enterprise, something carried through the worst possible cold and kept alive by nothing but stubborn attention, now feeding a town that had once, in its hungry or gossiping moments, been willing to let her die in exactly that cold, without much protest. Among the 11 families Reverend Kellerman had named that autumn was the Torvald household, a Norwegian homesteading family on thin marginal ground 8 miles north of town, whose eldest daughter Anya, 14 years old, walked the whole distance to the mill on the first Thursday of the arrangement, carrying a small sack of oats, the only grain her family had left to trade, and stood in the doorway too proud to ask outright for help, and too hungry not to have come anyway. Eleanor recognized something of her own younger self in the girl's stiff, careful posture, the particular pride of a person unwilling to name a need directly, and she did not embarrass Anja by naming it for her either, but weighed the oats fairly, ground them at the standing toll, and then, almost as an afterthought, sent her home that afternoon with 2 loaves of bread besides, telling her only that the ovens had run a batch too large that morning, and she'd be doing Eleanor a kindness, taking the extra off her hands rather than let it go stale. It was a small, transparent fiction, and Anya Torvald, 14 and hungry but not foolish, understood it for exactly what it was, and Eleanor watched her walk back up the frozen road that afternoon, with her chin held a fraction higher than it had been coming down it, a detail Eleanor would remember clearly enough, decades later, to mention it by name when Anya Torvald's own granddaughter came through the Bitter Creek School of Milling in 1920, asking whether the family story about a bag of oats and 2 loaves of bread in a hard winter was really true. Not every family that hard autumn accepted the mill's arrangement so easily. A rancher named Hollis Greer, proud in the particular brittle way of a man watching his own herd thin while a neighbor's wheat came in heavy, refused for the better part of 2 months to bring his family's grain to Bitter Creek at all, telling anyone who'd listen at the mercantile that he'd sooner go hungry than take charity dressed up as commerce from Thomas Whitfield's widow, a stance he maintained until the first week of December, when his own wife, without asking his permission, walked the 4 miles to the mill herself, with what little grain remained in their own bin, and came home with flour enough to see the family through the worst of the cold. Greer said nothing to Eleanor about it directly, that winter or for some while after, but he brought his full harvest to be ground at Bitter Creek every season from then until his death in 1897, a wordless amends Eleanor accepted, as she had learned to accept most amends in that country, without ever requiring it be spoken aloud. Cora Whitfield came to the mill in October of that drought year, not for gossip this time, but with a sack of grain from Silas's own thinner harvest, and an expression Eleanor had never before seen on her sister-in-law's face, something closer to shame than the practiced insinuation Eleanor had grown used to absorbing. "Silas won't say it," Cora told her, standing awkwardly in the mill's flour-dusted doorway. "And I don't suppose I've any right to say it for him after everything, but we'd not eat well this winter without this place, and I know it, whatever's passed between us. I said unkind things about you once, in front of half the town. I've thought on that more than you'd guess these last years." Eleanor did not offer forgiveness that easily, not in a single afternoon after 4 years of circling threats and forged writs, and a night nearly frozen to death in a line shack, but she took the grain, and weighed it fairly, and gave Cora her flour at the same toll every other family paid, no more and no less, and it was this plain, unsentimental fairness, extended without either warmth or punishment, that began, slowly, the long thaw between the 2 women that would not fully complete for another decade, but that had, that October morning in the mill doorway, undeniably begun. Garrett Boone made one final attempt on the north section that same autumn, riding out in November with a new offer, considerably higher than his first, for the coal rights alone, arguing that a mill and a bakery were fine sentimental enterprises, but that the seam beneath the creek bottom represented wealth on an entirely different scale, wealth enough, he suggested, to build not merely a mill but an empire. Eleanor listened to the whole of his pitch on her own porch, in the same patient, unhurried manner she had learned, over 4 years, served her better than argument, and then told him what she had told him once before, 4 years and a lifetime of trouble earlier, that the north section was not for sale, that it never would be, and that she had come, in the years since his first visit, to understand something about her own ground that she suspected he never would, that a mill feeding 11 families through a hard winter was a wealth no coal seam could match, however many dollars a ton it might fetch a man willing to tear the creek bottom open to reach it. Boone left Larkspur Hollow for good that winter, selling his remaining territorial interests to a syndicate out of Denver, and Eleanor never saw him again, though she would hear, years later, that the coal syndicate's survey of the county had in fact found the seam beneath the north section too thin and too deep to profitably mine at all. A small final irony she allowed herself to enjoy without ever once feeling the need to say so aloud to anyone but Jonah, on a quiet evening years afterward, when the memory had softened enough to be funny rather than merely vindicating. The transformation was not confined to Bitter Creek alone. By 1884, nearly a third of the ranchers in the county had put some portion of their own grass acreage into wheat, a shift the County Agricultural Society, the same organization Thomas Whitfield had once corresponded with in his last hopeful year, would later credit almost entirely to the proof Eleanor had provided during the drought of 1883, when deep-rooted grain had outlasted grass across a whole hard summer in a manner no rancher who had witnessed it could easily argue against afterward. Even men who had never once spoken to Eleanor directly, who knew her only by reputation and by the sight of her flour sacks stacked in Otis Pruitt's mercantile, began sending their own sons and hired hands out to Bitter Creek to study the layout of the mill race and the seed selection methods Eleanor had, by then, begun writing up in a plain pamphlet Reverend Kellerman printed for her on the chapel's own small press, a document that would circulate, within a few years, as far north as the Montana line and as far south as the Colorado border, carrying her father's Zanesville methods to ground her father had never once seen. Otis Pruitt, whose credit had helped raise the mill's first foundation stones, expanded his own mercantile twice in the decade that followed. The second expansion built explicitly to house the growing trade in Bitter Creek flour that moved, by 1889, not merely to Larkspur Hollow's own tables, but by freight wagon to towns Eleanor herself had never visited. And it was Otis, more sentimental in his later years than the thumb-waiting merchant of 1879 might have suggested he would become, who proposed to the town council in 1890 that Larkspur Hollow's main thoroughfare, until then known only by its surveyor's designation as 2nd Street, be renamed Whitfield Avenue in honor of the family whose ledger had first guessed, and whose widow had then proven, that the town's true fortune lay buried not in cattle, but in grain patient enough to survive a Wyoming winter. Eleanor herself, when asked her opinion of the proposal, said only that she'd have been just as content with 2nd Street left exactly as it was, since a name on a signpost struck her as a poor substitute for the mill's own continued operation as the thing worth actually honoring. But the council voted for the renaming regardless, and Whitfield Avenue it remained for the whole of the following century. By the autumn of 1884, 5 years to the season since Thomas Whitfield's death, the Bitter Creek Mill had grown from a single set of French burrstones and a low bread oven into the largest grinding operation between Cheyenne and the Montana line, its yard busy most mornings with wagons from 3 counties bringing grain to be milled and leaving with flour. And it was Reverend Kellerman, more sentimental in his old age than he had once let himself appear, who proposed to the town council that the mill's 5th harvest be marked with something more formal than the ordinary autumn gathering. a chartering ceremony that would establish, in writing filed with the county, the mill's grinding tolls and its bread relief arrangement as a standing institution of the town rather than merely the private generosity of one family, so that whatever came after Eleanor and Jonah Cole, whatever hard winters or good ones the town had yet to weather, the arrangement itself would outlast any single family's fortune or misfortune. The ceremony was held on the last Saturday of September, on the mill yard itself, with the whole of Larkspur Hollow in attendance, 194 souls now that the town had grown with the wheat trade, tables set with bread from every batch the mill had produced that week, and bunting strung between the mill's own gable and the new grain elevator Walter Pruitt, married by then to one of the 3 women Eleanor had first taught to bake, had helped raise the previous spring. Eleanor stood on the mill's loading platform in a dress of blue wool she had chosen herself rather than borrowed, with Jonah beside her and, at her skirts, her daughter Ruth, 3 years old, gripping a fistful of her mother's hem with the particular fierce concentration small children bring to the task of standing still in a crowd. It was into this gathering, witnessed by nearly the whole town, that Silas Whitfield rode, unannounced, in the early afternoon, and for one long cold moment the crowd's murmur dropped away entirely, old memory surfacing in 100 faces at once, the recollection of a forged writ and a blizzard 5 winters past, rising unbidden, the way old memory does, at exactly the moment a town would rather it stayed buried. Eleanor did not step back from the platform's edge. She had wondered, more than once in the preceding years, whether this moment or one like it would come, some final reckoning she would have to face in front of witnesses, and she found, watching Silas dismount and cross the yard toward her, with his hat already in his hands rather than on his head, that she was not afraid of it the way she might once have been. "I've no right to be here," Silas said, loud enough that the whole gathered yard could hear him, which Eleanor understood, watching his face, was deliberate, a man choosing to say in public what he might once have found easier to say only in private. "I tried to take what wasn't mine from a woman I should have helped instead, and I near got her killed doing it, and I've had 5 years to sit with that, watching what she built instead of what I tried to steal from her. I'm not here to ask forgiveness in front of the whole town, because I don't reckon I've earned the right to ask for it that easy. I'm here because Reverend Kellerman asked me to bring something, and I judged it belonged to her hands and not mine, whatever else stands between us." He held out then a folded paper that Eleanor recognized, unfolding it, as the original signed confession he had given her 4.5 years before, the document admitting the writ's forgery, which Eleanor had kept locked in the mill's own strongbox all this time as a quiet insurance against any future trouble, and beside it, a second paper she had not expected. A deed transferring to the town of Larkspur Hollow, in trust for the mill's continued operation regardless of who owned Bitter Creek Ranch in future generations, the 8 acres of creek-bottom land adjoining the mill that Silas himself had, in the years since the drought, come to own through a series of trades, land that gave the mill room to expand its grain storage as the county's wheat trade kept growing, land Silas could easily have sold to the highest bidder, and had instead, without announcement, signed over. "It's not enough to undo what I did," he said, still standing in the open yard with the whole town watching, "and I don't say it thinking it is. But it's what I've got to give, and I'd rather give it here, where folks can see it plain, than send it by lawyer's letter the way I once sent worse things by lawyer's letter, and let everyone go on believing I'd never own the whole of what I did." Eleanor took both papers and for a long moment said nothing, aware of Ruth's small fist still gripping her hem, aware of Jonah beside her not moving to speak for her, letting the moment stay entirely hers to close as she chose. "I won't stand here and tell this whole town that everything between us is settled, Silas," she said finally, "because it isn't. And I don't believe in saying a thing's mended in front of witnesses just because it's easier than saying the truer, harder thing. But I'll take this land, and I'll thank you for bringing it yourself instead of by letter, and I expect Cora and your children are welcome at this mill the same as any family in the county. Same toll, same fair measure, whenever they've grain to grind. That's what I've got to give back today. It's not everything either, but it's honest, and I'd rather start there than pretend at more. Otis Pruitt, standing near the front of the crowd with his own wife and the two grandchildren, who had by then taken over much of the Mercantile's daily counterwork, would tell the story of that afternoon for the rest of his life, much as Cora would tell it in later decades, though from his own angle of it, how the whole yard had gone still enough, in the moment Silas dismounted, that a man could hear the creak running under the mill wheel 100 feet off, and how the stillness had broken not into gasps or muttering, but into something closer to held breath, the whole town watching to see which way 5 years of accumulated feeling would finally tip. Reverend Kellerman, who had arranged the charter ceremony without any foreknowledge that Silas intended to appear, would say afterward that he had considered, watching Silas cross the yard, whether to intervene and spare Eleanor an unwanted confrontation in front of so public a gathering, and had decided, in the space of a few seconds, that Eleanor Whitfield had earned the right to meet whatever came to her that day on her own terms, without a minister's protection standing between her and it, a judgment he never once regretted making. It was not the dramatic reconciliation the town's more sentimental members might have hoped for, no embrace, no tears shared publicly between brother-in-law and widow, but it was, Reverend Kellerman would say afterward, the truest kind of ending such a story could have, an honest accounting between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a forged document and now stood, however imperfectly, on the same patch of ground, and the crowd, sensing that the moment had closed as much as it was going to close that day, returned by slow degrees to the bread and the bunting and the ordinary business of a harvest festival, while Silas Whitfield stood a while longer at the edge of the yard, watching his brother's widow accept the charter of an institution that would, in the decades to come, outlast every one of the men who had once tried to take it from her. The years that followed the chartering ceremony did not pass without their own smaller trials, because no life, however well built, moves forward in a single unbroken line of triumph, and Eleanor would have been the first to say so to anyone who asked her, in later years, how the mill had grown as large as it eventually did. There was a fire in the grain elevator in the spring of 1887, caused by nothing more dramatic than a spark from a faulty flue, much like the one that had nearly killed her a decade before. A fire that burned through 800 bushels of stored wheat before Walter and half the town managed to bucket enough creek water onto it to save the mill building itself. A loss that set the operation back most of a season's profit, and that Eleanor met, as she had met every other reversal, not with despair but with the same patient arithmetic that had carried her through the blizzard. A rebuilding fund raised in part from the mill's own accumulated reserve and in part, to Eleanor's genuine surprise, from small contributions offered unprompted by a dozen families who had, over the preceding years, come to think of the mill's continued operation as something closer to a shared civic possession than a private enterprise they merely patronized. There was a second daughter, Margaret, born in 1886, and a son, Thomas, named for the husband Eleanor had buried on the rise above the ranch house 9 years before he was born, and it was watching young Thomas Cole grow into a boy with his namesake's same quiet, unhurried manner of studying a problem before speaking about it that Eleanor found herself, more than once, telling her children the story of the first Thomas Whitfield's ledger, and its stubborn, hopeful margin notes about a wheat strain he had guessed at but never lived to see fully proven. A story she told not as tragedy, but as a kind of instruction, the way her own father had once used the story of his jammed grinding stone to teach her that most problems, given patience enough, could be taken apart one solvable piece at a time. Walter Pruitt died in 1909, 79 years old, having worked the Bitter Creek ground for the better part of half a century under 3 generations of the same family, and it was at his funeral, held in the same chapel with the same cracked bell that had rung over Eleanor's own wedding 30 years before, that Delphine spoke of her husband's quiet insistence, repeated to her many times over the years, that the whole fortune of Bitter Creek had turned not on any single dramatic moment, But on one ordinary December morning, when a young widow had knelt in frozen furrows, testing dormant wheat with her bare hand, instead of giving up the ground for lost, a small, unwitnessed act of patience that Walter had judged, watching it from a respectful distance that first winter, to be the truest measure of the woman he would go on to work for, without complaint for the rest of his working life. Cora Whitfield's thaw, begun that October morning in the mill doorway, with a sack of grain and an unaccustomed shame, completed itself by slow degrees over the better part of a decade, in the unglamorous currency of small, consistent kindnesses rather than any single dramatic reconciliation. A jar of preserves left on the mill's porch after a good harvest, an offer to mind Ruth and Margaret one autumn when a second bout of fever kept Eleanor abed for a week, a Christmas dinner in 1889, the first the two families had shared since Thomas Whitfield's funeral a decade before, at which Cora, watching her own children play alongside Eleanor's at a table set with bread baked from Bitter Creek flour, said quietly, to no one in particular, that she supposed some things worked out better than a body had any right to expect, given how badly they'd started, and Eleanor, hearing it, understood it for the closest thing to a full apology Cora Whitfield would ever manage to give, and found, to her own mild surprise, that it was enough. Eleanor formalized in 1890 what had for years been an informal practice, teaching any woman in the county who wished to learn it the full craft of milling and bread baking her father had taught her in Zanesville, not merely the mechanical operation of stones and ovens, but the deeper chemistry of grain, dormancy, and fermentation that had let her survive a blizzard and, in the years after, feed a drought-struck town, establishing what the county newspaper, in a feature article that ran the autumn Eleanor turned 36, called the Bitter Creek School of Milling, though Eleanor herself, with her usual disinclination toward grand titles, generally referred to it only as Thursday mornings, the day each week she set aside to teach whichever women, married or widowed, wealthy or poor, chose to walk the mile out from town to learn a trade that had, within a decade, become one of the most reliable livelihoods available to a woman anywhere in that stretch of the territory. Her sisters came from Ohio in 1891, the first time any of them had made the long rail journey west since Eleanor's wedding 13 years before, and it was watching her sister Margaret, the second eldest, stand in the mill's grinding room running her fingers along the same style of French burrstone their father had once operated on the Muskingum, that Eleanor understood how completely the small dishonest fear of her first marriage, the fear that a wife who knew too much might unsettle a fragile household, had been not merely overcome but entirely inverted. The knowledge she had once hidden from Thomas out of a bride's uncertain caution had become, in the years since his death, the whole visible foundation of everything she had built, taught openly now to any woman who wanted it, credited plainly to the mill owner in Zanesville, who had first taught his eldest daughter that grain, patiently understood, would always tell you what it needed if you gave it time enough to finish explaining itself. Jonah Cole died in the winter of 1911, not of the sudden fever that had taken Thomas Whitfield 32 years before, but of a long, slow failing of the heart that gave the family the mercy, at least, of time to say what needed saying, and Eleanor, 57 years old by then, buried her second husband on the same rise above the old ranch house where Thomas lay. The two graves close enough that Eleanor, walking up in the years that followed to tend both, sometimes found herself talking to the pair of them together, as if the two quiet, unhurried men, who had each, in their own way, trusted her competence before the rest of the world had learned to, might have found more in common with each other than either had lived long enough to discover directly. Ruth was 33 that winter, married to a rancher 2 counties over, and mother to 3 children of her own, and it was Ruth who took over the day-to-day operation of the mill's ledgers that same year, the same square, careful hand her mother had once taught her, now filling the columns Thomas Whitfield had first opened in 1877, a continuity of handwriting across 3 generations that the county newspaper, marking the mill's 30th anniversary in 1914, noted with more sentiment than Eleanor herself, by then a grandmother 11 times over, generally allowed herself in conversation, though she kept the clipping folded inside the same leather ledger she had carried through a blizzard 40 years before. A small private admission of how much the sentiment had actually mattered to her. Margaret Cole became, in 1902, the county's first licensed woman schoolteacher, having studied at a normal college in Cheyenne that Eleanor's mill profits had helped fund, and Thomas Cole, the son named for a man he had never met, took over management of the grain elevator's expanding freight operation, shipping Bitter Creek flour by rail as far as Denver, and by 1908 as far as Chicago, a scale of trade that would have astonished the ranchers who had once told Thomas Whitfield that a man who plowed grass for grain did not understand where he lived, and that Eleanor, standing on the mill's loading platform in 1909, watching a full freight car of her own flour pull out toward the rail junction, allowed herself a single quiet moment of satisfaction over before returning, as she always did, to the next column of figures waiting in the ledger. The Bitter Creek School of Milling that Eleanor had begun so modestly on Thursday mornings in 1890 had, by the time of her own death in 1924, at the age of 69, taught the trade to more than 200 women across 3 counties, several of whom had gone on to establish their own mills and bakeries in towns Eleanor had never even visited. A lineage of practical knowledge passed hand to hand, and hand to hand again, the way her own father's knowledge had once passed to her at 9 years old, beside a jammed grinding stone on the Muskingum River. And it was this lineage, more than the acreage or the freight contracts or even the family itself, that Eleanor named, in the last conversation her daughter Ruth would later record having had with her, as the true measure of what Bitter Creek had become. "A ranch is a thing that can be taken," Eleanor told Ruth, in the autumn before she died, sitting on the same porch where Silas Whitfield had once told her the ranch was no longer hers, "same as it nearly was taken from me, in a night I still don't much like remembering closely. But a woman who's learned to read grain, and fire, and cold, and her own 2 hands, carries that knowing with her wherever she goes after, into whatever kitchen or mill or hard winter comes next, and there's no forged writ, and no lawyer's letter, and no jealous brother-in-law that can ever take that particular thing away from her. That's what your father's ledger was really teaching me, all those years before I understood it. Not how to grow wheat, how to be the kind of person a hard season can't finish." Silas Whitfield had died in 1901, and Cora, in the years of her own widowhood that followed, had become, improbably to anyone who remembered the woman who had once gossiped about a widow's odd hours over a mercantile counter, one of the mill's most regular Thursday morning students, learning at 60 years old the trade she had once dismissed as unbecoming a wife's proper attention, and it was Cora, more than anyone else left living from that first hard winter, who told the story afterward, at church gatherings and county fairs, of the woman who had walked into a blizzard with nothing but a sourdough jar and a folding knife and had, within a decade, fed half the county through a drought that broke stronger men's herds, a story Cora told, in her later years, with something that had long since stopped being envy or suspicion and had become, instead, a kind of fierce and proprietary pride, as though the town itself, and not only Eleanor, had somehow earned a share in the telling of it. Ruth Cole's own courtship and marriage, in 1901, to a rancher named Everett Hale, from 2 counties over, was conducted, Eleanor liked to say afterward, with rather more romance than her own first marriage had allowed, and rather less drama than her second had required, and it was at Ruth's wedding, held not in the cracked-belled chapel but in the mill yard itself, strung with the same bunting that had marked the chartering ceremony 17 years before, that Eleanor stood beside Cora Whitfield, by then fully reconciled in the unhurried, unsentimental way the 2 women had built their peace, and watched her eldest daughter marry a man who had, in his own courting, ridden out to Bitter Creek often enough on excuses about stray cattle that Jonah had remarked, watching him from the porch one evening, that the young man seemed to have learned his methods from somewhere familiar, a small private joke between husband and wife that Eleanor never fully explained to anyone else. Margaret's path to the schoolhouse had not been an easy one. In a territory where a young woman's ambitions toward higher study were still met, even by 1900, with a good deal of skepticism from county elders who saw little use in educating a girl beyond what she needed to keep a household. And it was Eleanor who traveled to Cheyenne herself in 1898, ledger and mill receipts in hand, to argue before the Normal College's admissions board that a daughter raised on the practical mathematics of grain yields and freight costs was better prepared for serious study than most of the young men they routinely admitted without question. An argument that succeeded as much through the plain evidence of the mill's own accounts, which Eleanor left with the board as testament to what a woman's education could accomplish given the chance, as through any rhetoric she offered alongside them. Thomas Cole grew up hearing his own name explained to him almost from infancy, not as a burden but as an inheritance of a particular kind, and he asked his mother once, at perhaps 10 years old, sitting on the mill's loading platform watching the creek run high with spring melt, whether it troubled her that he carried a dead man's name rather than his own living father's. Eleanor considered the question with the same seriousness she gave every question her children asked her, however small, and told him that a name was not a debt owed to the dead, but a thread kept unbroken for the living, that Thomas Whitfield had given her, without ever intending it as a gift exactly, the ground and the ledger, and the first uncertain notes toward a wheat strain that had since fed half the county, and that naming her son after him was not a grief she carried, but a gratitude she intended never to let go quiet, the same gratitude, she told him, that Jonah Cole himself had never once begrudged, having said to her plainly, the week before their own wedding, that a woman who could hold two men's memory with equal honesty in the same heart was not a woman who loved either of them the less for it. By the time Eleanor's 11 grandchildren had all reached adulthood, scattered across 4 counties and, in 2 cases, as far as the new state of Montana, the story of the winter of 1879 had taken on, within the family itself, something of the quality of Scripture, told and retold at Christmas gatherings and summer harvests with small variations, each teller added according to their own memory or invention, until Eleanor herself, in her 60s, took to correcting the more embellished versions with a dry humor that delighted her grandchildren more than the embellishments themselves had. No, she would tell them, she had not fought off a wolf that first night in the line shack. As one cousin insisted, she had merely kept a fire alive with 4 split logs and more stubbornness than sense. No, Silas Whitfield had not drawn a pistol on Reverend Kellerman in the bank, as another version claimed. He had signed a confession in his own yard, with his hat in his hands, and said very little else. The plain truth, she would tell them, settling the matter each time with the same patient insistence she brought to a column of figures that would not balance, was dramatic enough without embellishment, and a family that could not tell its own history accurately, she said, was not much better prepared to learn from it than a woman who could not read the true condition of her own wheat ground. The mill Eleanor Cole built on the bank of Bitter Creek outlived her by more than half a century, and its endurance was tested most severely not in her own lifetime, but in the hard years that followed, when the drought and the collapsed grain prices of the early 1930s drove ranch after ranch across the county into foreclosure and left towns twice the size of Larkspur Hollow hollowed out entirely, their storefronts boarded and their populations scattered west toward whatever work California seemed to promise. Ruth Cole, by then in her 50s and running the mill much as her mother had run it, held the same standing arrangement Eleanor had chartered in 1884, the fair fixed toll and the twice-weekly bread baking, through those hardest years, and it was, the County Historical Society would later record, the single institution in Larkspur Hollow that never once closed its doors through the whole of the Depression, feeding families whose own grandparents had, in some cases, been among the 11 households Eleanor's first bread relief had fed during the drought of 1883, a continuity of hardship and quiet answer to hardship that stretched, by the 1930s, across 3 full generations without a single winter's interruption. Margaret Cole's granddaughter, a woman named Eleanor Voss, in honor of the great-grandmother she had never met, took over the School of Milling in 1952, expanding it, in the changed world of the mid-20th century, into a proper vocational program affiliated with the State Agricultural College, though she kept, as a matter of what she called family superstition rather than practical necessity, the same Thursday morning schedule her great-grandmother had first set in 1890, and the same insistence that any woman who wished to learn the trade, regardless of what she could pay for the instruction, would be taught it in full. It was Eleanor Voss who, cataloging the mill's old records for a county archive project in 1961, found the original leather ledger Thomas Whitfield had begun in 1877, and his widow had carried through a blizzard 2 years later, its pages by then soft and dark, with 84 years of handling, and it was Eleanor Voss who first noticed, reading it closely for the first time in a generation, the two small callbacks that had quietly bound the whole long family story together without any of its later tellers fully realizing it. Thomas's own hopeful, half-informed margin note, "The land tells you what it wants if you are patient enough to let it finish the sentence," written in 1878 by a man guessing at a chemistry his wife already understood better than he did, and, on the ledger's final used page, in a different hand and a different decade, Eleanor's own note, added sometime in her 60s, that read simply, "It did finish the sentence, in the end. It just took longer than either of us thought it would, and neither of us lived to hear the whole of it, though I expect our children have, by now." The jar of sourdough starter that Eleanor Whitfield Cole had carried against her own body through the worst night of her life was, by the mill's 100th anniversary in 1984, still in active use, its culture unbroken across 105 years of continuous feeding and baking, passed down not through any single bloodline, but through the whole accumulated community of women the Bitter Creek School of Milling had taught, across a full century, each new baker given a small portion of the living culture to carry home and keep alive in her own kitchen, the same way Eleanor's mother had once carried it across the Ohio River, and Eleanor herself had once carried it across 1.5 miles of killing cold. So that by the time the county marked the mill's centennial with a festival not unlike the chartering ceremony of 1884, there were, by one careful count taken that year, upward of 60 households across 4 counties, still baking bread each week from a starter that had begun, so far as anyone could trace it, in a kitchen in Zanesville, Ohio, sometime before the Civil War, and had never once, in all the years and all the hard winters between, been allowed to go cold enough to die. Del Ashby, the boy who had once come west with nothing but a horse and a debt he never named, died an old man in 1938 on the 40 acres he had bought with his own saved wages, his own wheat by then feeding grandchildren who had never known any other name for the crop than the one Eleanor had first taught their great-grandfather to plant. And it was said of him, in the small obituary the county paper ran, that he had never once, in 54 years of growing it, sold a bushel of grain to a hungry family at a price higher than the fair toll Eleanor had set at Bitter Creek back when he was young enough still to be called a boy by the woman who taught him. The mill stands there still, on the bend of Bitter Creek where Aldous Reyes once drove iron rods 6 feet into the gravel to test a foundation's bearing, its water wheel turning now by a current that has run, without interruption, for longer than any single life that first set it spinning. In autumn, when the wheat comes ripe on ground Thomas Whitfield first broke against a whole county's advice, the light falls across the creek bottom in the same low gold slant it fell the evening Eleanor stood on the bank and watched her husband's stubborn wager finally prove itself true, and somewhere in a kitchen not far off, on any ordinary Thursday morning, a jar of starter carried once across an Ohio river and once across 1.5 miles of killing cold is rising again, patient and unhurried, exactly as it has risen every week for longer than anyone left living can now fully count, needing nothing from the world but a little warmth, a little flour, and someone willing to keep it fed.